And now welcome to this week's edition of Where Did the Road Go?
That's right, and this week on Where Did the Road Go, we're going to be talking to Robert Schoch. And tonight's interview is actually going to go for 2 hours, as opposed to the standard hour, which usually ends up being about an hour 15 anyway. So, we're going to be going to 1 a.m. with Robert. Are you with us, Robert?
I am. It's good to be here.
Yeah, it's great to have you back. I'm pretty sure we got through a fraction of what I actually wanted to talk to you about the first time we had you on. So I'm glad you were willing to come back on.
Oh, it's my pleasure.
And you have, let's get to this first. You have a tour going on in a couple weeks in Turkey.
I do. We leave in, I'm terrible at the exact dates, but we leave in just under 2 weeks. So this is really the last opportunity. If people want to sign up, they should go to my website. And I think you have links to that also?
I do, robertschoch.com, and that's on wheretheroadgo.com.
Exactly.
Your Turkey tour goes from the 15th to the 28th of June.
Right. That's right. The 15th through the 28th of June sounds right. And we will be starting in Istanbul and then working our way to the east, ending in Urfa and Göbekli Tepe, this incredible site that we talked about last time, which is 12,000 years old, really the oldest site representing, should we say, civilization, ancient civilization in the world at this point. Really incredible, really sophisticated site. Turkey is just, I can't say enough good things about Turkey. If you're interested in the ancient civilizations, ancient mysteries, we'll be going to Cappadocia, for instance. And Turkey is just an incredible area. So we'll be covering everything from, classic Istanbul, and we'll be visiting some of the ancient sites that figure in the Bible, all the way back to these very, very ancient sites going back to the end of the last ice age.
Wow. You want to talk a little bit about Cappadocia? Cappadocia, is that right?
Cappadocia is a region in really central Anatolia, central Turkey, and there one of the things that's known for are these incredible underground cities. These cities, in some cases, are 8 stories or more deep underground. We'll be going into some of them, taking a look at firsthand, and they're a real mystery as to why they were created. But people that have read my book, Forgotten Civilization, they'll sort of know the answer to why I think they were created. I think they are a direct response to major solar outbursts, and this is a way to escape from solar flares, solar outbursts that humanity experienced in the distant past.
Now, go on. Do we know who built them?
No, people don't. People argue about that. In fact, that's one of the great mysteries of classical archaeology. They talk about, they really don't know who built them. We know that they were used even in Byzantine and Roman times and Greek times, but that seems to be a reuse, that they were actually much older. Like many of these ancient structures, they were being used and they were being reused and reused again. And I believe that the earliest versions of them, the beginning of this actually goes back to the end of the last ice age, probably Göbekli Tepe time, about 12,000 years ago.
Wow.
So some of them, they have very, very ancient precedents. And, like cathedrals, like other important sites, as I said, they were used and reused and reused again.
And we haven't explored much of these underground cities, have we?
No. In fact, very little is really known about them. Only a few have been explored. It's been estimated that there might be as many as 200 underground cities in the Cappadocia region.
Wow.
So it's really incredible. And also, some of them not the full cities, but there's still, and we'll see this on the tour, there's still homes that are built into the rock cliffs, the rock faces, and some of these are thousands of years old, yet people still live in them to this day. It's really, it's a different perspective than we have here in America, where everything is so new.
Right. Well, everything is so new, but we do have ancient mounds and things like that.
Yeah, we have. That's what. Yeah, of course, we have ancient mounds and whatnot. But I mean, in general, American cities, American houses, that type of thing are very new.
Yeah.
I live in Boston, and Boston is one of the older cities in the country because it goes back to 1630. Well, 1630 is virtually nothing.
Yeah.
When you're talking, Europe and the Middle East and the ancient civilizations that have lived there. And, I was just in the UK. I was just in Glastonbury, and I'm talking to someone casually, and she's talking about a house that she's purchasing, and part of the house is over 400 years old, and that's not even particularly old for that part of the world.
Wow. Now, I had talked to Andrew Collins a few weeks ago, and he was talking about Göbekli Tepe and said that he believes that some of it was buried parts at a time, and then they'd build a new section after burying an old section, or be building a new section. Is that anything you're familiar with?
Yeah, actually, when I was just at Megalithomania in Glastonbury, Andrew Collins and I both spoke, and I will say that I disagree with Andrew Collins, with all due respect, on some of his interpretations of Göbekli Tepe. He sees it somewhat differently than I, should we say. Parts of it, it's not clear that parts of it stratigraphically were buried and then other parts were buried and built. He sees it as a series where they were building one stone enclosure, then burying it, then building another one, burying it, that type of thing.
Right.
I think all the evidence actually indicates that that's just not the situation whatsoever. What you have at Göbekli Tepe are a number of stone circles, should we say, sort of Stonehenge-like, and they were built, and then others were built, and others were built, and they were built to a certain extent progressively, one after another, because they're realigning them based on precessional changes.
Mm-hmm.
Changes in the stars and the orientations. And I actually, frankly, disagree with what Andrew Collins thinks they're oriented to, and we can talk about that also.
Yeah, well, he said that he feels they're all aligned to Cygnus and Deneb in particular.
He thinks everything in the world is aligned to Cygnus. To sound the wrong way. But we can get to that. If you
Okay. Sure. I mean, if you want to explain your view on it, I'd love to hear it.
Yeah. Essentially, what you have is a number of stone circles. Think of Stonehenge stone circles. I was just at Stonehenge a week or two ago with the Glastonbury Megalithomania. Stonehenge consists of pillars that are freestanding, and that's what you have at Göbekli Tepe.
Right.
They filled in walls between them, essentially, as I see it, as essentially turning into defensive type structure. And they were trying to support the walls, and some of the pillars had. It's very clear that this is the secondary building of the Göbekli Tepe structures, and something's happening, and something somewhat catastrophic, should we say. There's clearly something going on. It's a different nature of building. It's a different style of building. It's like they're reinforcing. They're virtually turning it into what I would call fallout shelters, just to give people a sense of what's going on. So they're going from something that is purely, you could think of it as purely, I believe, astronomical in function, to something that is a bit fortified, if you would.
Mm-hmm.
And then after that, it becomes clear that they fill in the whole thing simultaneously. They fill it all in the way I see it, is essentially as an act of desperation, because they had tried to fortify it, they had tried to build it up. There's every indication, I believe, that they're experiencing cataclysmic times, and they tried to build it up, they tried to reinforce it, if you would, and then eventually they just cover the whole thing over in mass. And at that point they build essentially an artificial mountain over the entire complex, which is about 300 meters or more in diameter. Yeah.
Right.
How tall it was originally. This is pretty well established, and I with all due respect to Andrew Collins, he's a friend. I like him a lot, but that doesn't mean we agree with everything.
Oh, sure.
He sees Göbekli Tepe as oriented toward Cygnus, the swan in the sky.
Mm-hmm.
And his basis for that is, in my opinion, virtually incomprehensible. I see it as oriented to astronomical alignments, and I have hypothesized tentatively that the primary alignment was Orion, because when you look at the central pillars of Göbekli Tepe, they are facing toward the south. It's very clear because they're anthropomorphic. They have arms and hands, and you can see from their hands down toward their belly, and they have belts, beautiful belts and loincloths. You can see which way these pillars are facing, and they're clearly facing toward the south. And all of the enclosures are facing that way, oriented that way. And when you look at the time period of Göbekli Tepe, which has been determined independently based on radiocarbon, based on stratigraphy, that type of thing, you're talking the time period that straddles the end of the last ice age from about 8,500 BC to 10,000 plus BC. And at that time, Orion, Taurus, the Pleiades, and we know that these were very important constellations in ancient times, were rising on the vernal equinox. We're at the orientation that Göbekli Tepe, the Göbekli Tepe pillars are looking toward the south. So I've hypothesized that this was the possible orientation, what they were pointing at. Andrew Collins has said it's Cygnus, which is to the northwest. Essentially, if you look out and you see Orion, Taurus, Pleiades to the southeast, you turn around and you see Cygnus to the northwest, and he's pointed to what's known as a vulture stone and said, well, that represents Cygnus. Now, I don't deny that that might be the possibility, but I think that's probably a secondary orientation of just one of the enclosures, because it turns out the other enclosures, which are to the south downslope from the first enclosure, if they were actually oriented towards Cygnus, it would be impossible because you can't see Cygnus to the northwest at that point because the other enclosures are in the way. They were built progressively, if that makes sense. It's hard to explain without having the diagram in front of you. So, I mean, they're being built progressively downslope toward the south. I think it's fairly evident they were oriented primarily toward the south, to southeast, not to the northwest. And it precludes the possibility of a primary orientation involved being Cygnus, even though the one early enclosure may have had a secondary orientation to Cygnus. And when it comes right down to it, most ancient structures, they're not built for just one reason or one purpose or one orientation. They're multi-purpose. So I think it's a little more complex in some respects. And Andrew Collins says, I don't think his cosmic blueprint is the entire, as he calls it, he's called it the cosmic blueprint. His cosmic blueprint is the entire and final word on the significance of Göbekli Tepe, far from it. And ultimately, I think that the message of Göbekli Tepe is something I think we talked about last time, which is that this is a site that goes back to the end of the last ice age, clearly indicates that you have high civilization at the end of the last ice age, thousands and thousands of years before anyone suspected was the case, except for, I'll point out myself, I've been talking about this all along based on my work in Egypt and the redating of the Sphinx, but the scholarly community, the classical status quo, said this was impossible to have civilization going back that long ago, but here we have evidence of Göbekli Tepe. I want to mention a story I've heard since we last spoke. A Turkish fellow, and Göbekli Tepe is in Turkey. He was making a documentary about Göbekli Tepe, and approached an Egyptologist who had never heard about Göbekli Tepe before. Egyptologist, and he started showing her pictures of Göbekli Tepe and saying, well, this has been radiocarbon dated back to 12,000 years ago. Look at this. What do you think of that? And she says, no, that's impossible. It's absolutely impossible. Nothing could be that sophisticated and that old.
Wow.
That's been the approach. That's been the attitude, to just absolutely dismiss it as impossible that you could have civilization going back that far, something that sophisticated going back that early. And I may have mentioned it last time we were discussing this on your program, but if you take it in isolation, so for instance, if that Egyptologist had just been shown those photographs of the structures at Göbekli Tepe and said, well, how old do you think this is? She probably would say, oh, looks like it's about 3,000 or 4,000 years old at most. It's that sophisticated, not 12,000 years old. So we've got a real disconnect there between the standard view, the sort of the standard wisdom, if you would, the standard dogma of when civilization is supposed to have started, and the evidence on the ground was something like Göbekli Tepe. And then this gets back to what we were just talking about, because you have this sophisticated civilization at the end of the last ice age, 12,000 or so years ago. What happens to it? And that's a big part of what I've been working on, and I talked about in my book, Forgotten Civilization. And I believe we talked about last time that there's this major solar outburst, I believe, at the end of the last ice age, causes dramatic climate changes, causes essentially cataclysmic disaster on Earth, and that's what wipes out these early civilizations, throws them into a tailspin, sets them way back, and then it's only a reemergence of civilization 4,000, 3,000 BC, not the beginning of civilization at that point.
Right. Now, so much of Göbekli Tepe has not been uncovered yet, and so they've only carbon dated part of it. Is it possible that we're going to find that some of this is even older than what we've discovered so far?
Yeah, I think that's actually quite conceivable. I was actually working on, the research continues, and I've been researching this further since you and I last spoke, which wasn't that long ago. I'll be researching it more, actually, as I travel to Turkey in less than 2 weeks now. There are indications that there are stone circles. I just found this out. One of the stone circles that's underground at Göbekli Tepe apparently has been measured, and I want to look into this more once I'm in Turkey in about a week and a half. One of these stone circles is said to be 3 times as big as the largest stone circle that has been partially excavated. And this was found by seismic means, by geophysical means, things like ground penetrating radar, that type of thing. And supposedly, based on the remote sensing data, the seismic and the geophysical data, one of these circles is much larger than the largest one that's been excavated so far, and all the indications are that the largest pillars in it are much larger than the largest pillars that have been excavated so far. And some of the pillars that have been excavated thus far are over 5 meters tall, and it's estimated that in this big circle, possibly some of the pillars are 10 meters or more tall. So
wow,
over 30-foot pillars.
Wow, that's
incredible. Yeah, this is absolutely incredible, and they're completely covered at the moment. And it's quite conceivable that they go back even further than 12,000 BC. So there could be some real surprises in store for us.
Any idea when those are going to get excavated?
No, that's part of the problem, in the sense that apparently the long-term plan for excavation spans some 50 years now. I mean, literally talking about taking 50 years to excavate the entire site. It's really incredible. But if there are 10-meter tall pillars underground at Göbekli Tepe. I mean, 10 meters, over 30 feet is really significant. That is the size of some of the erect moai on Easter Island. We were going to talk about Easter Island, I think. Big heads and torsos on Easter Island, which are so mysterious and enigmatic, and also show iconography, I believe, similar to some of the Göbekli Tepe pillars with the position of the arms and the hands. So there's some strange similarities there from, the middle of the Pacific all the way to Turkey.
Wow. All right. Well, actually, let's move on to Easter Island for now. And last time we talked about the script and how the solar outbursts might play a part in what the Rongo Rongo script actually says.
Right.
But we never talked about any of the archaeology on the island. And now, one of the things, do all the statues have bodies?
Yes, as far as anyone knows, all the statues have bodies. They all seem to have bodies that end just below the waist. So they don't have, with a couple of exceptions, they don't have legs. So essentially the statues are heads and torsos with arms down, sort of holding the belly, framing the navel area. And they're all very stylistically similar in that sense, although they're also all unique. If you start looking at the Easter Island statues, they fall in certain categories, and they look very stylized, but each statue is a unique statue unto itself. There are slight differences from statue to statue.
Okay, and why the navel? The navel seems to be a very important part of ancient cultures. The phrase navel of the world seems to come up a lot. Why do you think that is?
Yeah, it seems to be have multiple meanings. Some people suggest, well, that's a position of prayer, that's a position of meditation. Other people suggest it really is connection. It's connection of us to the cosmos, of the universe, sort of the whole concept of birthing, but in a cosmic sense, or connection to the really larger cosmos, larger universe. I suspect that, in my opinion, it has to do with that type of connection. They are essentially holding the belly navel region. In the case of the Easter Island Moai, I'm convinced that they're looking toward the sky. And why? Because there's things happening in the sky. My hypothesis is that one of the major driving factors is solar outbursts that were so influential, so important. One of the native names for Easter Island is eyes looking toward the sky, referring to the Moai looking toward the sky. They also have a legend about things happening in the sky and essentially the sky collapsing and falling down and then going back up again. And I believe this is referring to what you would see in the sky, configurations essentially. People think of northern lights, but northern lights, orders of magnitude greater than anything we've seen today. You would see that type of thing in the sky during a major solar outburst, even as it caused climatic effects, as it caused earthquake and volcanic activity to accelerate on the surface of the Earth. If you're talking end of the last ice age, of course, would cause melting of glaciers, that type of thing.
Right.
I think they realize that we are integral to the larger universe, that we are integral to nature, part of nature. I think in modern people have lost that connection until disaster hits, when they're hit by a tornado. It's been horrible. I'm sure everyone's heard about all the tornadoes recently, or the hurricanes, the floods. I saw in the news today they had incredible, I think in Minnesota, northern lights, because there was a minor coronal mass ejection that hit the Earth just recently. So we see these things to this day, but it was much greater at certain times in ancient history, and the status of the sun. So I think the Moai are in part memorializing these types of phenomena. and also sort of saying, pay attention, this is going to happen again, this can happen again.
Now, during the last ice age, how big could the island have been, and do you think there could be any connection to legends of like Mu and Lemuria and stuff?
Yeah, that's a good point. First off, it would have been larger. I don't know how much larger. We'd have to really look at, which I haven't been able to do yet, look at the coastal area around Easter Island. Clearly, it would have been much larger because overall mean sea levels were as much as 100 meters or so lower, over 100 meters in some cases lower, at the height of the last ice age, because so much water was tied up in glaciers. So really dramatically lower sea levels, and you have vast expanses of land around the world above sea level at that time, which are now buried under the oceans. And Easter Island would have been no exception. So it would have been much larger. It wouldn't have been a huge continent, but it would have been much larger, much more significant. We have all these stories of Lemuria or Mu in the Pacific or Indian Ocean, of course, the concept of Atlantis. And my view right now is that all of those really refer back to an ancient civilization or various ancient civilizations at the end of the last ice age. Some people spend a lot of time trying to figure out where was Atlantis, where was Lemuria, where was Mu. I don't know if we spoke before I went to Japan recently or after Japan.
We spoke, I believe, in the beginning of middle of March, maybe.
Okay, so I've actually been to Japan since you and I last spoke.
Oh.
So, and this ties in because I was in Japan once again looking at a site known as Yanaguni.
I was going to ask you about that later.
Oh, okay. Well,
But go on now. That's fine.
Yeah. Well, it ties in with the whole concept of Mu and Lemuria, because Yanaguni is a site in Japan. Yanaguni is a little island, which is now part of modern Japan, but it's actually an island off of, not off of the coast, but near the coast of Taiwan. It's east of Taiwan, so you can stand on western Yanaguni on a clear day and see Taiwan in the distance to the west. At the end of the last ice age, there was actually a land bridge between Taiwan and Yanaguni. That's how much lower the sea levels were, and people could literally walk from Yanaguni to Taiwan and back at the end of the last ice age. But off the coast of Yanaguni, and this is what has interested so many people, there is this incredible structure, I'll call it the Yanaguni Structure, Yanaguni Formation, that looks like a step pyramid or looks like the side of a step pyramid. And in my opinion, there's no question that this was exposed. It was above sea level when sea levels were much lower at the end of the last ice age. And some people have suggested that this was in part of Mu or Lemuria. It was essentially part of the Mu-Lemuria complex at the end of the last ice age. And we know that there were ancient people living on Yanaguni and Taiwan at that period, that remote period, about 15,000 plus years ago. And so maybe this was part of the inspiration, part of the, stories that were passed down through thousands of generations, and we still have as, expressed in terms of Mu/Lemuria.
Now, you have said in the past that you feel the monument was actually a natural formation, but it might have been crafted by man, right?
Exactly, and I've been there several times. I was there April once again because British, I can't go into detail, but bottom line is British television film production company asked me to come look at it once again. And I'm convinced that, number one, it's primarily natural, but number two, there are ancient remains of peoples there at the end of the last ice age. And this is a structure that if they didn't actually build it from scratch, which I don't think is the case at all. I think it's primarily a natural structure. Certainly they would have recognized it as being an incredible structure, just like we recognize it now, and they may have touched it up, they may have modified it slightly. Think of a mountain that sort of looks like a certain shape, and you modify a little bit to enhance it, that shape, and they would have utilized it.
Now, I think Graham Hancock said there were also some stone circles around it as well.
Yeah, there's some stone circles near it. It's not clear that they're artificial. And then if you go to Okinawa, there are other stone circles that there's a stronger chance that they be artificial. One thing you have to keep in mind here is that when you go to the Far East, there's a very, very long tradition of working nature and enhancing nature, venerating nature for its own sake, that type of thing. One analogy I use, and it's a good analogy, important analogy, it's actually a tradition that goes back thousands and thousands of years, are things of like Zen Gardens. Think of a Zen garden where you have natural boulders that have just been slightly rearranged and venerated. Or I have a Chinese friend, and he was telling me recently about what they call scholar stones, where they take a natural stone, but they mount it on a wooden base, and hold it as a beautiful object. Yes, it's a natural stone. So there's this interplay between artificiality and nature. And often the distinctions are very, very blurred when you get to the Far East. Very different than, say, a Western European aesthetic, where it's very clear that Stonehenge, for instance, is an artificial structure.
Right.
But then even, I'm thinking about some of the sites I saw in England just in the last week or two, where you take natural stone blocks, clearly unworked, but they're arranged in stone circles artificially. So a lot of ancient people, there was...
They used what was there.
They used what was there. Now it's interesting going back to Göbekli Tepe. We were talking about Göbekli Tepe. Göbekli Tepe people did not simply use what was there. When you look at the pillars of Göbekli Tepe, every single pillar is beautifully carved, incredible craftsmanship, incredible work went into carving every pillar with reliefs of animals and symbols and whatnot. So it really varies. It really varies from one period to another, one culture to another. You go to Easter Island. We were talking about Easter Island, and can come back to Easter Island. The Moai are entirely carved, but on Easter Island you also get petroglyphs. So you get carvings on natural boulders, which are clearly artificial carvings, but they're on the natural boulders, the natural outcrops.
Right.
All kinds of creations.
Now, these Moai, are some of them buried?
Yeah, well, no, yes and no.
Okay.
It depends on what you call buried. And let me explain. Some of them, a lot of the Moai are buried at the moment up to their shoulders, up to their chins. And I am convinced that this is natural burial, that not a situation which some people have suggested where, some people have hypothesized for whatever ritual purposes they carved these Moais and they dug big holes, big pits, and stuck them in the pits and buried them purposefully, buried them artificially. So not that type of burial, but a lot of them are buried up to their chins or so, but all the indications are is that this was natural sedimentation that slowly buried them, which implies that they're extremely old. Some have been excavated in the past. Catherine Peace Routledge, a woman, actually led an expedition to Easter Island in the early 1900s, and she and her crew excavated some of these buried Moai and found in every case when they excavated them, even the ones that were buried all the way up to their chins, they had full bodies underneath, but no legs. Thor Heyerdahl, I'm sure lots of people have heard of the late Thor Heyerdahl, who did things like kon-tiki and the Raw, and he was known for his expeditions of reconstructing how ancient peoples could cross the Atlantic and Pacific Ocean. He spent time on Easter Island with his research crew in the 1950s. He also excavated some Moai. He excavated one Moai in particular where it was buried up to its shoulders. He excavated down more than 6 meters and found that this was a really tall Moai, and it had been buried in more than 6 meters of sediment. Again, there was a full torso there. And then just recently, in the last couple of years, several Moai have been excavated likewise, and they're finding the same thing. And every case, I'm a geologist, and I've looked at the data, and in every case where you have these excavated Moai, all the indications are that the sediment filled in slowly, gradually, cumulatively. It was not a case where they either dug a hole and artificially buried it. That looks very different geologically. It was not a case where there were all of a sudden landslides that catastrophically buried these Moai up to their necks. It wasn't a tsunami that washed in and buried them. In fact, if it were a landslide or tsunami, these tall Moai, you would expect them to be knocked over and buried, very differently. So all the indications are that these were buried in sediment, the ones that are buried slowly and gradually, which suggests that they're a lot older than traditional archaeologists have proposed. Traditional archaeologists say that the Moai, even the oldest Moai, only go back maybe 1,000, 1,500 years at the most, depending on who you talk to. But given the rate of sedimentation I've been able to document on Easter Island, given what we know geologically, I think these Moai have been very much underestimated in terms of their age. And then there's other reasons to think that Easter Island goes back much earlier. We were talking about the end of the last ice age, and wouldn't Easter Island be much larger? I think that's absolutely the case. Thor Heyerdahl documented a lot of what he believed were cultural connections between Easter Island and South America, which goes against the traditional point of view. The traditional point of view is that Easter Island is really Polynesia, the easternmost portion of Polynesia, so that the origins of Easter Islanders, most people or conventional archaeologists and historians would trace to the west, to Polynesia. Yeah, Thor Heyerdahl suggested that there was a connection between Easter Island and the east, that is South America. And in fact, one thing he found was a very unusual Moai. And so this is the exception to the rule that Moai don't have legs. Thor Heyerdahl excavated in the 1950s Moai, what's called a Moai Big Statue. You can see it to this day on Easter Island, which looks very different than the other Moai in terms of its facial features, in terms of its body features, and it has legs on it. But the legs, it's not standing on its legs, it's kneeling on its legs. And it looks for all the world like many of the statues that you find, for instance, in Peru and Bolivia at Tiwanaku. For instance, these kneeling statues. This is what that Moai looks like, and he drew the logical conclusion that there might be cultural relationships between Easter Island and South America. When you look at some of the megalithic stone constructions, on Easter Island you have something known as ahus. Some of the Moai were erected on these ahus. These are big megalithic stone platforms which were built, and the Moai, some of the Moai were positioned on them. Some of these ahus in their construction techniques look much more South American than Polynesian. So there seems to be a connection there. And he suggested, Thor Heyerdahl suggested, that the origins of Easter Islanders, or at least some of their origins, may have come from South America. Something I've played with conceptually is that maybe it's not that they're originating in South America or in Polynesia, but maybe it's the other way around. Maybe Easter Island itself was primary. And then there were a diffusion, a spreading from Easter Island, both east and west, to South America on the one hand and to Polynesia on the other hand. And that gets back to something you mentioned, the concept of Mu or Lemuria as sort of a primordial civilization, if you would, in the Pacific and spreading out from there. So I wouldn't be surprised, we don't know for certain at this point, but I wouldn't be surprised if Easter Island culture isn't much, much older. I think it is much, much older than classical archaeologists give it credit for. And maybe it's much more central. Maybe it really influenced both Polynesia and South America.
Now you also said that these moai are made of two different types of stone, correct?
Very, very good point. And that's a really important point. Most of the moai, the classic moai, are made out of volcanic tuffs. It's known as it's all volcanic on Easter Island. All the stone is essentially volcanic. It's a volcanic island. But most of the moai, the big moai that can be 30 or more feet tall, they are primarily carved out volcanic tuffs. And you can go to the quarry. I'd love to go back to Easter Island. I don't have any immediate plans, but I'm actually trying to work on putting together an Easter Island trip again to take people there and get back myself. I've been there a couple of times. But when you go there, you can see the quarries where the majority of moai were carved. It's very clear, and you can still see some moai in the quarry. There's one moai that's over 60 feet tall. It wasn't left unfinished, basically, but it's a humongous thing. And if it had been finished and freed and moved, we're talking about moai that would have weighed over 250 tons. So I mean, they had incredible plans, and they really knew what they were doing. But most of them are made out of this volcanic tuffs, which admittedly is not easy to work, but it's easier to work than basalt. The other class of moai, which are much rarer and tend to be much smaller, are actually carved out of basalt. Basalt is also a type of igneous rock, but it's much harder, it's much finer, it's much more difficult to work with. And these basalt moai, there's two things about them. One, they're much rarer. The ones that have been found, there's one in the British Museum. It was abducted from Easter Island in the 19th century and it's ended up in the British Museum, where it's prominently on display. It's carved out of basalt. These basalt moai, in every case, were found within or under other Easter Island ruins. So that means that they're much earlier than the other Easter Island moai. They're much earlier than the ahus because they were found under them. So there's one that you can still see in the museum on Easter Island. It's known as a female moai. It was found in two different parts and it's since been put back together. The head was found in the body. It's relatively small but very beautiful and carved out of basalt. It was found at one of the ahus deep underneath the ahu. So deep underneath the other moai. Another basalt moai was found actually reused and built into one of the ahus. So again, we know it's much older. So all the indications are for every single basalt moai that's been found is that they are older than the other moai. The second thing about the basalt is that we don't know where it was quarried. It must have been somewhere on the island, but there are no good basalt quarries known where one can argue cogently this is where the basalt came from to quarry these moais. And my suggestion is that, well, those quarries might have existed on a former Easter Island, but this would have been an Easter Island going back to the end of the last ice age that we talked about, because you expect stratigraphically that the basalt quarries would be lower down, and as sea levels rose since the end of the last ice age, my speculation is that the basalt quarries were flooded, that they're now underwater, that they are off the coast of the present Easter Island. So if we could find those basalt quarries under current sea level, that would clearly indicate that they are much older, that they date back to the end of the last ice age, and it would, in a flash, be absolutely convincing evidence, I believe, that Easter Island culture goes back thousands of years earlier than classical archaeologists right now accept. And it gets more interesting even because the Lake Jacques Cousteau, the famous French diver who did so much, to make people aware of the underwater world, he and his team at one point were on Easter Island, diving off the coast of Easter Island, and they saw what they described as very rectangular sort of openings or cavities or depressions, should we say, in basalt rocks off the coast of Easter Island. And I think that they may have actually seen ancient quarries. They didn't necessarily recognize them as such because that's not what they were looking for. But from the descriptions I've received of what they supposedly saw, they may have hit upon them. So tantalizing evidence that Easter Island culture goes way back. And also, I don't know if I said explicitly enough, these basalt moai are the most sophisticated moai. They are the best carved moai, the most beautiful moai. The finest workmanship is found on the basalt moai, even though it's a much more difficult rock to work.
Well, like everywhere in ancient cultures, it seems like the oldest stuff is the best constructed.
Yeah, exactly. That's why I was mentioning Göbekli Tepe. Göbekli Tepe is the workmanship at Göbekli Tepe 12,000 years ago is much better than a lot of later constructions, later workmanship.
How do you think they moved the heads on Easter Island?
Oh, that's a good question. People argue about that. If you look at the conventional points of view, they'll tell you all kinds of stories about how they depopulated the island of trees. Right now it has very little wood, very few trees. There's indications that there were palm trees and whatnot in much greater abundance on the island previously. And the classical story is that they were carving these big heads and torsos as busy work, because it's a small island and they had to have something to do to keep the populace from, causing trouble for the chiefs. And so the classical story is along the lines that they carved these big moai, that they used tree trunks as rollers to roll them around on the island and move them. I don't buy any of this, but I'm just giving the classical archaeological point of view. And in the process, they cut down all their trees and caused horrible environmental havoc on the island. I don't think any of that holds up. It's not an island where you could easily be rolling trees around and rolling moai around on, logs from trees. There are ancient roads that crisscross the island, but recent studies, and I say recent, just in the last couple of years, indicates that these roads were not substantial enough to be moving moai along. They're probably more for people walking along them, processional roads, that type of thing, not for actually moving moai that weigh tens of tons. Another view is that the moai were sort of propped up on, not stilts, but serving a scaffold framing, so they were actually moved while they were standing vertically, and they were, quote, walked, that they were sort of pivoted back and forth and moved along that way. I don't find that necessarily really convincing either. When you talk to the ancient when I say ancient, the traditional Easter Islanders, and ask them about their traditions and how the Moai moved, they always talk in terms of supernatural powers. They use the term mana, which is essentially a way of saying paranormal, that they were moved paranormally or psychokinetically. Of course, modern archaeologists and historians, they just dismiss that as being absolute nonsense. They also talk about the Moai being carved with very primitive tools. They'll show you these primitive obsidian tools and that type of thing, which, it's just not very convincing, honestly, to me, that this is how they either carved them or moved them by the conventional explanations. So I think it's a real mystery. I hate to say, I speculate myself that maybe they did use, to a certain extent, what we would term paranormal means to move the Moai. Because you do have a situation on Easter Island. It was isolated for thousands of years, clearly, even as an origin of some civilization very early on. It does seem to have become isolated and was a world unto itself until 1722, when it was rediscovered by Europeans, by the Dutch explorers in particular. And up until that point, it was a really closed, isolated society, and they may have been able to accomplish things with means that, we really don't understand. One suggestion, I know you talk about paranormal topics on your show sometimes, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And one thing that you find with certain types of paranormal phenomena, and I've studied this seriously, so I'm seriously interested in looking at these phenomena once you get rid of all the fraud and the bunk and the nonsense. What you find is with certain types of paranormal phenomena, collective belief, true belief is incredibly important. And if you have, I've speculated that if you have a small closed society like you had on Easter Island, you could have a much more homogeneous belief system, which could affect, in a real sense, paranormal phenomena that in the so-called modern day, with all the cynics around, really is not possible to the same extent, if that makes sense.
Right, yeah, absolutely.
So, in some ways, I think that Easter Island, if we could get back to the classic or traditional Easter Island, there's a lot to learn from it, because they may have had literally a sort of a different worldview, and this may have had a very different real-world effects, should we say.
All right. You got married there too, didn't you?
Yeah. Katie and I were married on Easter Island. We were the first marriage in 2010.
Nice.
First marriage on Easter Island in 2010. We were actually married twice because we had, it's Chilean territory, it's part of Chile. And we had a civil ceremony, official civil ceremony, so legal marriage. And then we also had a traditional Easter Island marriage. Easter Island is known as Rapa Nui in the native language, so we had a Rapa Nui marriage. We wore traditional Easter Island feathered headdresses and clothing. I was lent a bark cloth cape, traditional bark cloth cape from Easter Island, which I realized in hindsight is a real museum piece. It had been passed down through 5 generations, and
wow,
it really honored me letting me wear that for a couple of hours. Must probably, I'm sure it must be well over 100 years old. But
well, such a perfect place to get married.
Yeah, it absolutely is. It absolutely is. I would recommend it to anyone who wants to get married.
Well, in particular for you too, based on where your life has gone with this stuff.
Oh yeah, exactly. It really was. It really was the perfect place for us to get married, and it was one of these things. Personal mystery of Easter Island, and we got married the way we wanted to. Yeah, we were traditional. The traditional marriage was really nice because we wore traditional clothing that we were lent. As I said, we were barefooted. They painted us with, in the traditional way with the essentially mud and minerals of the earth, and we were standing barefooted on the earth. And the Rongo, we were painted with some of the Rongo hieroglyphs for the wedding ceremony. It was quite something.
All right, well, we got to take a quick break. We'll be back with Robert Schoch in a few seconds. You're on WVBR FM Ithaca, and we'll be back after this.
The opinions expressed by the host and guests on Where Did the Road Go